What up, though? It's your boy back again. This real talk we're gonna do a little bit. We're gonna kind of follow a little pattern because I noticed I've done some things, so I'm gonna kind of stay with this pattern for a minute. So, talked about my kids, talked about my brothers. Today, I want to talk about my parents, right? And really just a moment of clarity, a moment of realization that I had. So, we're gonna call this real talk. The day that I realized my parents were just people. So, my mother had me when she was 19 years old. And, we moved from my grandmother's house to moving into Vegas with my aunt, my grandmother, my uncle. Then eventually we moved out, got our own apartment, moved into another apartment, then another apartment. Then finally my mother purchased a home and we moved in there. So sometime around when I was 12, 13, my mother met and married my stepfather. He was a cop in LA. And so we had to move from Vegas to LA. Hindsight being what it is, looking back on it, her marrying him probably saved my life. Because up until that point, man, I was a real delinquent. I mean, I was on the edge of professional delinquency. You know, and when I go back to visit Vegas, all of my friends that I had at that time, right, are either in the penitentiary or in the morgue, and I would have been right along with them, right, because I was part of the crew. So we moved to LA, eventually settled in Victorville. Um, the relationship between me and my stepfather kind of started to slowly deteriorate over time. And it got to a point where, I mean, he had to put me out. I was 17. I had to get put out. So on my own, started my senior year of high school. It took me a couple of weeks, but I got my feet under me. I mean, I had a job. And five other friends, we all went in on a three-bedroom apartment, right? So we were fine. Um, then eventually, fast forward, I leave for the military. My relationship with my stepdad had always been kind of, I mean, it was cordial. It was cordial. And then in the early aughts, my stepdad and my mother got divorced. And I was really angry with him. I didn't even know what caused the divorce. I just knew they were getting divorced. I was angry. I was pissed. And what started to kind of turn me was watching how he treated my mother in the divorce. Right? It wasn't like most divorces, right? Where you become enemies and it's just like, how much can I hurt you, you know, until this is over. I mean, their divorce seemed very, very like mature, and he took care of her financially and made sure she was okay. Um, and they got divorced. So it wasn't like he and I really had a reason to have a relationship anymore. He and my mother were divorced. And I'm not even sure how we got to this. I think it was because, yeah, I'm just not sure how we ended up being in contact with each other. And in the time that my stepfather and my mother, got divorced, I had gone through a divorce, um, and subsequently got remarried. And when I got remarried, that was the first time I really understood my stepfather. So background on him, right? He's this young single guy in his early to mid 30s, living in LA, uh, fast times, just having a ball. he had some nieces and nephews, but he didn't have any children, right? So he had really no experience with children. So he marries my mother, and suddenly he's a father of this 13-year-old juvenile delinquent. Right? So he was like thrown into the fire immediately, right? It's sink or swim, sink or swim. And as a man, as an adult now, and I became a stepfather, I was like, man, I get it now. I mean, I had a much better concept of it because, like I always say, I made two and I inherited two, right? So I was already raising children. The big shift for me was at the time my daughter was 5, right? So there wasn't, I really hadn't had to deal with anything yet with my 5-year-old, and my wife's daughter was 11, right? So now I have a young lady that I have to raise. But I basically just did what I knew I was going to do when my daughter got older, right? And I think both of them turned out to be very awesome, mature young ladies. But going back to my stepdad, he had like no book, no guidance, and I'm sure he probably asked his friends, and their reference is going to be, their interactions with their children, right? And you can't necessarily, spank a stepchild unless that's an agreement between you and their parent, right? So it's a different dynamic that he was working with. And now we have this super cool, weird relationship where when I travel sometimes from Hawaii going back to Florida, on the way back home, I will kind of put a day or two delay, in Texas. So I go hang out with him, right? And we hang out and we talk about everything, right? Sometimes he even asks me about relationship advice, right? I'm giving relationship advice to my stepdad, right? But I love hanging out with him, right? We're like really good friends now. And I think it took me growing up and being able to understand that he was just a man thrown into a situation and was doing the best he could. And when I started looking back on it from this perspective in hindsight, my stepdad always really, really tried. He's the kind of parent that if you are going to play a sport and you need gear, he's going to go to the sporting goods store and say, what is the best top of the line, thing? When they say it, that's the one he's buying you. That's just how he does everything. Best, top of the line, and he always did that with us. And I took it for granted and didn't remember it until I got older and I could look back and respect it. But he was just a man, and he was trying to figure it out. The other side of this divorce was my mother. And my mother just, when she started dating, right, and she started with these step dance groups where they go around and they dance, right. My mother's always on the road, always doing something. And I think the poignant statement from my mother was she said, I've never lived alone before, and this is the first time in my life when I'm living alone. I was like, what do you mean, Ma? And she explained it. I mean, she went from her mother's house to living with my aunt and grandmother and uncle to living with me, to living with me, to living with me, to being married to my stepdad, to having my little brothers, to living with just my little brothers, and now suddenly she's living alone. That's strange, right? My mother's, first time living alone. She's 50 something years old when this happened. And I look at all the things she does now. Like my mother, she's one of those people that does that. This is my birthday week, right? She's celebrating all week. I'm like, Ma, you go hard in paint, Ma. And I realize it's because she gave up a lot of her youth raising me. And now this is her time to just enjoy life and enjoy, you know, getting to know herself. And I had to recognize that my mother is just a woman. Right? And I don't mean that in a derogatory way to take anything away from her, but she's a woman. She's got needs, you know. She gets lonely. Um, she wants to date. She wants to be appreciated. And that's one of those weird things because you come into this world, and I think for so long you look at your parents as these omnipotent beings that are supposed to be perfect. I don't think you ever catch on to they're just humans trying to figure it out. They're just people trying to figure it out until you get to a certain age, and now you look at it and go, "I get it, get it." I think that'll resolve a lot of that. If you're holding on to something or frustrated about something that happened between you and your parents, I think we stop and look at it as they're just people, right? There's no guide to this. They're just trying to figure it out, just like you're trying to figure it out. I think that changes the perspective, because all parents make some mistake. Every parent is going to make some mistake. And if you're a new parent, and you think, not me, you're going to make a mistake. Sometimes just by the luck of the draw, right, you come away from it unscathed. Because I always thought it strange, right? Like, my children are all very well spoken, very intelligent, can carry a conversation in any room. Whenever people meet my children and talk to them, they're always kind of taken aback because the way I talk. I'm like, raise great kids, right? All of them, all four of them. But there were times when like my kids would do stuff, right? And, sitting around as a parent, complaining about your kids being bad and doing stuff, and people would have like real stuff, like, yeah, my son stole the car and ran into the neighbor's garage. I'm like, oh, like the worst I could say about my kids is, yeah, son forgot to take the trash out, so I put him on punishment for a week. And I never had to deal with that with my kids. So maybe I just lucked out. I wonder if they've gotten to that point now where they're starting to see me as just a man. I don't know. Well, that's all I have for today. It was just kind of a crazy, poignant thought. It kind of floated into my mind on my commute home. So I'm going to end this the way I always end it. I'm just saying, fuck out of here. Holla at your boy.